Hi, my name's David Martin and I'm joined by my co-host Craig Patterson. This is the Heads and Horizons podcast where we and our guests discuss the challenges of leadership and how with a little professional help and support, leaders can better navigate change, deal with organisational complexity and create a more productive and engaging work environment leading to higher team performance. Hi, my name's Dave Martin, a former technology sales leader turned career and leadership coach, and I'm joined by Craig Patterson, the former Chief Technology and People Officer and now an Executive Coach. I suppose the first thing to do is welcome you to this, which is the first episode of Season 2 of Heads and Horizons, a podcast where Craig and I explore some of the challenges leaders face today and the role coaching plays in helping to support them. We're going to talk today a little bit about what we've termed the lonely seat and how leaders can best cope with isolation at the top. But before we get into that, it's been a couple of months, Craig, since we last did one of these. So before we get into the topic, why don't you just give us a bit of an update on what you've been up to over the summer?
Yeah, thanks, Dave, and really great to be here again with you, and hopefully bringing some insights to people who listen to our podcast. But yeah, the summer's feels a long time ago now. I mean, it went very quickly. We had a great summer here in the UK, as people will remember if you've been here. Tomatoes are finished. Anybody who might have picked up on last season's,
I'd forgotten about the tomatoes. How?
Yes, yeah. I think I might forget about them next year. The supermarket variety seems to probably be a little bit more plentiful. But what I've been doing really is through the summer I was finalising my route to result coaching model, which is a proprietary model that I've developed, and I was very pleased to get it trademarked. And I'm currently in the process of launching that and looking to bring it to market. So exciting times. And what about you, Dave? What have you been up to?
I suppose the most thrilling thing I've done over the summer, Craig, is take some time out. Really, take a little time away from coaching, or spend some time in southern Spain. Whilst, as you said, the summer's been pretty good in the UK. Nice to get away in somewhere that guarantees you a blue sky every day and discover some of the Moorish history of southern Spain. It's good to recharge, and maybe we can talk about the importance of these things at some future point. We maybe do a podcast on it even, Craig. So that was my main thing this summer, if I'm honest with you.
Good, sounds excellent.
So look, Craig, should we get into the topic? Because as always, we want to keep these discussions to a sensible time limit. So we're talking about, and it's something that we've touched on previously, the notion of the closer you get to the top of an organisation, the lonelier it gets. That's sort of the paradox of leadership, isn't it? That whilst we're surrounded by people, being at the top of the organisation is often one of the loneliest places to be. And now, with that comes the weight of responsibility, tough decisions, dealing with confidential information, sensitive information, and the accountability that you can't always share with anybody. Any thoughts from you before we dive into that in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it's there'll be some people out there who don't suffer from that, and maybe they're particularly independent types. They sort of relish having all of the decision making with them, the challenges with them. But I think for a vast majority of people, actually that loneliness can hit at any point, really, or it might be something that people go through from time to time. And I think it's particularly when there's a big decision to be taken, and that could be people, it could be organisation, it could be financial. And I think it's at those times when a lot of people will go through a feeling of just being on their own, not having that sounding board, that person or place to go to ask the stupid question.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I know myself from my own experience, I can't claim to have got anywhere near the very top of any organisation, but I've certainly led teams many times during my career, certainly in the latter a couple of decades. And I know myself, I can relate to that feeling of that feeling of to have all the answers and not having them, or being expected to have all the answers, I should probably say, and not actually having them. It's not as if you can naturally. Well, I certainly never felt that I could. I never felt I could naturally turn to any of my peers, and certainly not my boss, and comfortably ask or admit to the fact that I didn't have all the answers and ask for the necessary help. Because I certainly felt that that would be an admission of lack of competence or lack of capability or credibility or whatever it was. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But I certainly felt the pressure of leadership at that point, the pressure of the loneliness that comes with that you are expected to have all the answers, and when you don't often feel that you can confidently and competently turn to turn to the people who probably do. Looking back and reflecting back now, I can see how I would have and perhaps should have handled that better by surrounding myself or getting some peer level contacts some peer level contacts who could have been that critical sounding board. But at the time, I just didn't do that, and as a consequence, it did become a really lonely place.
You're not going to be alone in that, Dave. And I think it's in reality, I don't think people in those sort of positions naturally, have the answer of where to go, because that's the whole point. Because if they knew where to go, they probably wouldn't be so lonely. As you said, it's a very risky strategy to really be able to, within the organisation, to identify anybody that you can really, ask that question that you should know the answer to. We say that, you're not going to have all the answers. Of course you're not going to have all the answers, but there's still going to be things where even if you've got a pretty damn good idea, you're going to maybe benefit from bouncing that around. But to do that within the organisation is by sure risky. I mean, what I think I've seen is when people don't ask others, when people do face that loneliness, sometimes that anxiety can show itself in ways of people being distressed, angry, frustrated, annoyed, and taking that out either in the way they behave or with others. And I think that's something to look out for. I would just encourage anybody who's in that position to think about who could they contact, who could they speak to. This isn't a shameless plug for coaching. Clearly, a coach is a route to provide that if you can find someone that you believe understands what you're working through. But even forget about a coach, even somebody independent that you believe gets it. That's important.
And I think that's a really valid point. Seeking mentorship or coaching or whatever it is, that's not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of maturity and self-awareness. I was reading something recently, actually, that I'm not going to suggest the veracity of this is necessarily strong. I don't know where it came from, but it was certainly an opinion that was voiced that actually women more naturally than men do seek out coaching as an investment in themselves in positions or situations like this, whereas men see it as more of a corrective mechanism. When something's gone wrong, that's when they seek help and coaching, rather than seeking mentorship and coaching, rather when before it becomes an issue as an investment in themselves. But you're right, strategy to cope and reconnect is really built around trusted networks and also encouraging honest feedback, cultivating trusted truth tellers within the team, and being willing to accept that feedback. Regular self check-ins, noticing when stress or loneliness is shifting from situational or occasional to chronic. Not easy, not suggesting it's easy, but those are the sort of things that I would try and relate to myself. Recognizing those signs of isolation are not easy, but important. Over reliance on one or two trusted voices is also another sign I would suggest, and that avoidance of trusted feedback.
Absolutely. Just to touch on the point you made about male versus female. I mean, look, things are shifting in that regard, but that's consistent with things like going to a doctor, isn't it? This is the same sort of issue where men, quite often believe, they've got to just get on with it. To your point, is it a sign of weakness to say that you need some help or you need you need somebody to talk to? Excuse me. But I think that we've just got to keep encouraging it. We've just got to keep saying to men as well as to women out there who maybe feel similarly that, to your point, this isn't a weakness. This is something that I do believe, whilst I said at the beginning, there will be some that don't believe they need or suffer from this. There will be an awful lot that do. And my encouragement would be just to take the leap of faith, because you're not alone. You're not the only person who's ever felt lonely. I can remember, if you don't mind, I would like to give just an example of my own experience when I was Chief People Officer in my last company. And one of the things when you're Chief People Officer is that you are working with the board and the Remuneration Committee Chair on executive pay. And one of the things that you need to be doing is working with the external remuneration advisors, which are specialist consultants in that area. Something, for example, like long-term incentive programs. This is like shares that people would maybe get. People understand the basics of those things. But when it comes to somebody who has received shares, I think you get the fact that they vest or they're basically, they need to be above water to make money, or they're restricted share options. I think people might get that bit, but what people don't always understand is that you need to be able to understand the mechanics of how those things, the mechanisms of how those share plans pay out. And that's not something that nobody had ever taught me that. So you're having to learn it on the call with the REM advisors. You don't really want to say, look, I don't really understand this. I've never gone through it before. So you have to do a lot of listening. You have to do a lot of deep diving. And you do at times think, crikey, have I got the capability to do this? Luckily, I got there. I did a lot of reading. But it's not simple. Did I feel comfortable to say I don't get it? No. Would I like to have talked to somebody that did know it and in a safe environment? Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not going to labour the point by saying I can relate to that and give my own example, but I absolutely can relate to that, Craig, and I have. Whilst it was a slightly different scenario, I've certainly been in positions where I've been sitting and listening to something, thinking, "Crikey, I haven't really got a clue what's going on here." Yet I realise that I'm supposed to know. Whilst this is a bigger topic in its own right, and probably one we may come back to, at a future point, that's also, I think, where imposter syndrome manifests a little bit as well. When you start thinking, how did I possibly get here? Well, I am not qualified. I mean, I'm not capable enough to be in this position. You start to second guess and question yourself in situations like that, which has its own, vicious downward spiral of its own. And like I said, that is an entire topic that we could touch on at a future point. But the other thing I was going to touch on, Craig, is how we create cultures that reduce loneliness. But I also wanted to touch on something that poked my or piques my curiosity today, or attention rather than curiosity, and that's that. This stuff comes with consequences, right? We all talk about the need to be high performing, which is a nice segue into what I'm going to touch on in a second. But to be high performing, we have to be physically and mentally well. That is an absolute state that we have to be in. If we're going to perform at our best, we have to be physically and mentally at our absolute peaks. It's actually something that is touched on by a guy called Mark Efron in a really interesting book of his, which 8 Steps to High Performance, I think is the actual title. And whilst certainly at points in my career, I felt that I had to wear hard work as a badge of honour, doing 50, 60-hour weeks. I'm glad to say things are more progressive nowadays, but it's still not perfect. And these sort of things come with consequences. And I'm just going to quote a couple of statistics. Again, I don't know the origins of these, but they were quoted by Jake Humphrey, who's the sports TV presenter here in the UK and host of interestingly, the High Performance podcast. And he made the point that success doesn't cure depression. Money doesn't buy mental health, and achievement doesn't fill in any void. And here's some interesting things. Successful people, I don't know where he got these figures from, but he certainly quoted them, so I'm going to re-quote them now. Successful people are 3 times more likely to suffer from anxiety. High achievers report feeling empty despite external success. And 1 in 4, 25% of leaders struggle with mental health issues in silence. So as I say, just dealing with loneliness in absolute silence and the consequences of that, that does have impact. That has impact on our ability to perform at the top level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, high achievers I don't have any statistical evidence of that, of what I'm going to say, but I think there's generally an expectation from themselves to be the best at what they do, putting themselves under a great deal of pressure to have all the answers, to be the best. So I think it's sort of hand in glove, really, with how this can happen. But I think that, as I think I said before, I'd implore people to say that just to recognise you're not alone. Don't suffer. Honestly, don't suffer in silence. It sounds a funny thing to say, but saying it out loud. Don't sit there and think you haven't got the answer, even if you are a high performer, because actually, probably being a high performer, as I said, puts you under that pressure even more for the answer. And therefore, recognise that very few people in the world, there are some that purport to have all the answers, but there are very, very, very few like that, if indeed, truthfully, any. And so be a little bit kind to yourself and recognise that every now and again, you do need to chat something through. And to your point, it is not a weakness.
No, very much so. And I'm just conscious of time as always, so just keeping one eye on the clock. Because, I think you've actually created a culture where vulnerability is considered a weakness. I think it's incumbent on leaders to actually set the tone. Modelling openness and vulnerability encourages connection, I think, at every level. Building shared ownership rather than that kind of top-down isolation is another way of trying to flip that notion of it being a weakness around. Maybe designing leadership teams as genuine partnerships, not hierarchical silos, would be another way, and certainly encouraging peer mentoring, which is what we've touched on already, is a way of doing that. So, personal anecdotes aside, any kind of closing thoughts from you, Craig, before we wrap up?
My only comment would be to reiterate, this is a natural thing. There is help out there. Don't see it as some sort of knock in your confidence or capability because you're asking for help. Sometimes it's just a sounding board, just a sense check, just getting that knowledge from somebody who does know something that maybe you're still struggling with, don't understand. But first and foremost, don't see it as a weakness.
Absolutely, and I would just add to that don't view it as a failure. What can leaders do to reduce isolation today? Well, one simple thing would be to schedule at least one candid conversation each week. Join a peer network, get that feedback. Reflect on the support systems that are around us all. Be that in the office or outside. And I'd also suggest, not easy, but try and reframe that solitude actually as an opportunity. It's actually a time for reflection, creativity, and growth when it's actually balanced and intentional rather than anything else. So great conversation, Craig. I think we've probably reached a natural conclusion there, and again, probably up against the clock as we always are. Fascinating discussion. A little more back and forth in terms of format this time, which I hope works well for the listeners. But thanks again, Craig, and thank you to everybody for listening. Please, if you are listening, do subscribe wherever you're picking up this podcast, as episode 2 will follow over the coming weeks.